Okay. Senator.
Thank you, Laska Hirlik, and thank you, Minister, very much for giving us the time this morning to come into this House. The tax relief scheme for the purchase of adapted vehicles for disabled drivers and disabled passengers is instigated, as you will know, by the granting of a primary medical certificate. This is an excellent scheme which makes a huge difference. It means the difference between many disabled people actively participating in their communities as opposed to being prisoners in their own home. It means the difference between disabled and elderly people being able to attend hospital appointments or not. In rural constituencies such as the area I come from in Mayo, we rarely have an option of public transport, and Galway University Hospital is a 6-hour round trip, or a Dublin hospital is a 10-hour round trip. My question is very simple. Why do profoundly, permanently disabled people continue to be discriminated against in the criteria for accessing this scheme? Why are people with upper body disabilities excluded from this scheme? Is equal access to hospitals and other services not important for them? I want to tell you briefly of 3 cases who come to mind this morning. And the first one is a woman who has her arm amputated to the shoulder. Minister, it's not going to grow back. She needs a specially adapted vehicle to get around, just the same as if she lost her leg. She lives on her own and has no other means of transport. Is she not entitled to access the relief scheme as someone who has a disability on their lower limbs can? The second one is an 8-year-old boy who is peg-fed and has severe scoliosis and is not strong enough to undergo the operations he desperately needs. His parents have frequent trips to Crumlin Hospital and to many other hospitals. They need an adapted vehicle for the long and tiresome journeys they have to undertake. Why are they refused access to the relief scheme? Thirdly and lastly, Deirdre is a 12-year-old girl. She has a condition called Cornelia de Lange syndrome. She is non-verbal and has complex physical and mental special needs. As Deirdre cannot speak, I want to speak for her and her parents. They're a fisherman and a housewife, and they live in a remote rural area. Given Deirdre's multiple health problems, they have continuous trips to hospitals and services: speech and language therapy, paediatrics, orthodontics, neurology, urology and genetics. Why in heaven's name do they get a letter back saying, due to the strict criteria laid down for the primary medical certificate, you are unsuccessful in obtaining same? I am begging you, Minister, put an end to the humiliation and struggle Deirdre and others with profound permanent disabilities are faced with in being refused transport just because their main disability is in their upper limbs. I know you are a man of compassion. You are now in a position to right this wrong. I would ask you, Minister, to re-examine the criteria for this tax relief scheme with your Minister for Finance and stop the discrimination against people with upper limb disabilities. Finally, Minister, I want to ask you, when is the motorised transport scheme, which was closed in February 2013, going to be reinstated? Thank you, Laska Hirlik.
Thank you, Senator. Minister.
First of all, I want to thank Senator Rose Conway-Walsh for raising this very, very important issue in the Shannon today, and I am well aware of her strong support for all people with disability. And just to say, as the new Minister for Disabilities, I appreciate any support right across all the parties, because there are times in there when you have to really fight and to demand for services and also for the rights of people with disabilities. But I want to express my thanks for your support. Now, in relation to raising this particular matter, as you may be aware, my colleague, the Minister for Finance, operates a tax relief scheme for the purchase of adopted vehicles for disabled drivers and disabled passengers. He is also responsible for the setting up of eligibility criteria for this scheme. The Disabled Drivers and Disabled Passengers Tax Concession Scheme, to give its full name, provides, number 1, relief from VAT and VRT up to a certain limit on the purchase of an adopted car for transport of a person with severe and permanent physical disabilities. Secondly, the payment of a fuel grant. Thirdly, an exemption from the motor tax and exemption from toll bridge charges. To qualify for the scheme, an applicant must be in possession of the primary medical cert. To qualify for a primary medical certificate, an applicant must be permanently and severely disabled within the terms of the Disabled Drivers and Disabled Passengers Tax Concessions Regulations 1980 and 1994 and satisfied a range of conditions. The extent of the involvement of the health personnel relates to making a professional clinical determination as to whether an individual applicant satisfies the medical criteria. This determination then is undertaken by the senior medical officers for the relevant local health service executive, the HSE administrative area, on behalf of the Department of Finance and the Revenue Commissioners. However, these HSE personnel have no role in setting or amending the criteria, and I think that's the kernel of the issue in relation to this debate. A successful applicant is provided with a primary medical certificate which is required under the regulations to claim the release provided for in the scheme. An unsuccessful applicant can appeal the HSE's Senior Medical Officer's decision to the Disabled Drivers Medical Board of Appeal, which is under the auspices of the Minister for Finance. The Appeals Board makes a new clinical determination in respect of the individual. This Medical Board of Appeal is independent in the exercise of its functions and to ensure the integrity of its clinical determinations. And that's an important point as well. Therefore, I, as Minister for Disabilities, can have no role to play in the exercise of these functions. I have been informed by the Department of Finance that the criteria to qualify for the scheme are necessary, precise and specific. After 6 months, a citizen may reapply if there is a deterioration in their actual condition. It should also be noticed that the scheme represents a significant tax expenditure with the cost of over £50 million to the Exchequer in 2015, up from £48 million in 2014. So there is a £50 million cost there as well. That's something that we have to keep our eye on as well. When I say in relation to us, there are other people with another agenda in relation to that £50 million. The Minister for Finance has informed me he recognised the important role the scheme plays in expanding the mobility of citizens with disabilities. He has managed to maintain the relief at current levels throughout the economic crisis, despite the requirement for a significant fiscal consolidation. He has also informed me that from time to time he receives representations from individuals like yourself, Senator Rose, who feel they would benefit from the scheme, but who do not qualify under the 6 criteria. While he has sympathy for these cases, given the scale and scope of the scheme, he has no plans to expand the medical criteria beyond the 6 currently provided for. Now, in relation to another issue you raised, which is related to this issue as well, which may be of insistence in the future, I am pleased to inform the Senator that the Programme for Partnership Government acknowledges the ongoing drafting of primary legislation for a new transport support scheme by the Department of Health. Work on this policy proposals in this regard is in an advanced stage, and I anticipate that I will be bringing it before the Government shortly. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you, Minister. Supplementary, if you wish, Senator.
Thank you, Minister. A couple of questions from that. Are you saying that we need to change the legislation, and what part can you play in changing the legislation? I appreciate the role of the Department of Finance, but I think we really need to get to the bottom of this. And if legislation needs to be changed, then we need to put that forward. And certainly my own party will prepare that if it's necessary, but I would appreciate your guidance on it. You know, the Minister's sympathy is of no use in trying to get sick and disabled people to Galway or a Dublin hospital from Mayo. All the sympathy in the world isn't going to do that, but we do need him to act. I want to ask you specifically, how many appeals have been received by Dún Laoghaire in the past 12 months, and how many how many decisions have been overturned in favour of the applicant? I appreciate it will take you some time to get that information, but I would appreciate it, because time and time again people are going to Dún Laoghaire and they are being dismissed from there, and people are so desperate now, and people who have appealed after the 6 months time limit are saying, what's the point in dragging a sick child all the way up to Dún Laoghaire again just to be refused? And I just want to ask you, when you say that other legislation is going to be brought around the motorisation grant bill, when are the heads of the bill produced, or when are the heads of the bill going to be there? Is it going to be before Christmas? And at what stage then could you see, how long after that could you see before a decision is made in that motorisation grant being accessible for people again? Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Senator.
I want to thank Senator Rose Conway-Walsh for raising these very, very important issues. And of course I accept your point about the families and the 10-hour trips. And also, I mean, you mentioned 3 genuine cases. So part of my role as Minister for Disabilities is to try and reflect and bring that view in. But you see this morning that this particular issue specifically, it's covered under the Department of Finance. Now that's something that I have an issue with, and an internal debate with. And if legislation needs to be changed or amended, of course, that would be part of my risk. My focus on the person with a disability, and the 3 cases you mentioned this morning, these are something that we're not talking about sympathy, we're talking about equality, we're talking about justice for these families. That's not an issue for me. So the principle of what you're saying is, so what I've got to try and do is get around that. So my own gut feeling is legislation needs to be changed, and that would be part of my portfolio as well. So that's something that we'll check up and follow out. You mentioned there in relation to the appeals. I'll find out the precise information for you and I'll come back to you. I don't know this morning and I haven't got an update. And then the very important question that you raise is in relation to the motorised grant. I managed to get that into the programme for government, and it's on page 71 there. The new legislation introduction a new mobility scheme to assist those with disability in meeting their increased mobility costs. There's a couple for 3,000 or 4,000 people would fit into that category. The answer is, as of this morning, I was talking to my officials this morning, and they are hopeful. I'm hopeful to get done, have it ready in the next couple of weeks. But they're saying to me, to be safe before Christmas is the answer. To be safe. But I want it in the next 2 weeks, personally, myself, but they're telling me, the officials, with legislation, with the preparation, that it will definitely be before Christmas. So that's the stage we're at. But just to go back on the whole issue, just to reassure you, the issue is we are trying to reinvest and rebuild on our health service. We've had a rough couple of years, as you well know, and that we need to do, the focus has to be on rebuilding that health service. And in relation to my portfolio as Minister for Disability, I want to try and get my slice of the cake to try and progress the issues that you raised this morning. But once again, thank you for raising them, and I'll come back to you on those appeals answers later on.
Thank you.